Kate Reid has lived two extraordinary lives, one at 300 kilometres an hour, the other at 3 a.m. in the pastry kitchen. Before she started Lunar, the temple of laminated dough that turned the humble croissant into a cult object, Kate was an aerospace engineer, working in the high-pressure, male-dominated world of Formula One. But underneath the precision and perfection that drove her success, there was a compulsion that almost destroyed her.
It was really, a perfect storm and a culmination of a pretty negative working culture. It fostered in me what went undiagnosed as depression and anxiety. I think it was probably this realisation of this dream that I'd had for so long, the reality of it not meeting that very high expectation that I'd built up.
Burnout, eating disorders and a complete collapse of identity forced Kate to rebuild from the ground up through pastry. This is Curveball and I'm Kellie Riordan. Shortly, Kate Reid of Lunar and what we can all learn about that very fine line between aspiring for excellence or falling victim to perfectionism. Kate Reid was just 23 and a graduate of aerospace engineering at RMIT in Melbourne when she found herself walking into one of the world's most high-pressure environments. She was one of just a handful of women. Kate, can you describe what it was like that very first day when you walked into the F1 team at Williams in London?
Well, I think the first thing to understand is that at this point in time I was living out a lifelong dream, and I'd been dreaming about what this moment would feel like probably since about the age of 13. So you have a lot of time to build up an incredibly high level of expectation in that decade or so, considering that every single thing I'd done up until that moment had been in some way to forward that dream coming true for me. I remember waking up and going through all the different steps that you go through on any normal day and kind of feeling a bit like I was robotically floating through all the tasks to get me to the point where I was at the security gate and being handed my security pass that had my photo on it. And then the HR person was leading me into the aerodynamics facility, which is the most highly secured area of the entire factory because I guess the most secretive development work is happening in there. And discovering that this was going to be my new reality, my place of work, my place of existence. It was pristine, which was, I think, the first thing that I noticed. It was a relatively new facility that had been built maybe a couple of years ago. It had 2 wind tunnels. And I mean, up until this point, I'd only ever seen a fairly outdated flow visualization wind tunnel at Monash University. And suddenly there was 2 state-of-the-art wind tunnels, one 60% and one full scale. And the full scale one had a rolling road to try and replicate the movement of the wheels turning on the road. And when I was walked into that wind tunnel, the race car was tethered to the road and they were testing it, and this was the closest I'd ever been to a Formula One car. It was so overstimulating of the senses that, you know, when you're trying to take everything in, you get home and I don't think I've ever been more exhausted in my life because it was like all of those dreams coming to life in one day. I guess that was my first day at Williams and my first impression of my new life.
And what was it like to work there? What was the average day like? How hard were you working?
Well, our contracted hours were 8:30 to 5:30, but if you dared to leave the office any time around the 5:30 mark, and I'm talking like between 5:30 and 7, everyone would look up from their computers and under their breath comment, "Oh, are you doing a half day today?" Which is wild to think now. I mean, you know, I understand employment law pretty well these days, and to ask anyone to work a minute over their rostered or contracted hours is veering into overtime and or being an illegal employer. But I think it was just given in F1 that 8:30 to 5:30 was a joke, and that you would stay until the work was done or to prove that you were committed enough. I think when I first walked into the office and I had this idea of this pristine, clean space, part of that pristineness, which I hadn't really clocked at the time, was it was completely silent. Like, you could hear a pin drop in the office, and I learned that that was just the rule. You know, you really, unless you were having a very important conversation with one of your team members, you stayed silent and you focused like solely on your work on your computer. And I mean, you've bet me for 5 minutes, but you can probably
you like
already
to talk.
I love to talk. And I think I had this view that, you know, working in Formula One is such a privilege. It's the pinnacle of motorsport and the automotive industry worldwide. And at the time in the mid-2000s, technology that was being designed in F1 was in part cascading down to the commercial automotive industry. So it was having an impact on the cars that you and I drive. You know, things like active suspension and regenerative braking were Formula One technology first. And so I had this idea that, you know, in Formula One, they can attract the very best engineers and brains in the world because they have their pick. Everyone wants to work there. And then they have this huge amount of resource and money coming from their sponsors, and often like just large private backers. And then we're designing race cars that travel around the world on planes to race at glamorous circuits and make a lot of people a lot of money. And I thought, surely we must all realise this privilege that we've got working in the industry. It's going to be really collaborative. It's going to be fun and exciting and fast-paced, and brilliant ideas will be brought to the fore, and we'll all have the chance to explore them and experiment and test them. And it just wasn't that.
So it's this very high-performance culture, and you're one of the only women there working as an engineer. What was that part like for you?
I was the only woman working in a technical capacity at Williams at the time. It was a company of about 500 people, and there were other women working in HR, marketing and hospitality. But I have to say, I mean, by this stage I'd done a 5-year degree in aerospace engineering, and I was one of only a handful of women in that. So it wasn't a new experience for me being in a male-dominated environment. And by the time I earned my job in Formula One, it was very clear in the office that everyone had had to work incredibly hard and make themselves stand above other engineers to achieve this job. And so no one ever made me feel like I was the girl in the office. I was just another aerospace engineer that had had to work incredibly hard to earn my place there. And I actually think that many of the guys would say during that time when I worked at Williams that maybe having me in the office brought a bit more, you know, conviviality and a bit more of a community and a happy feel to the office, because I was just naturally chatty. I might not have been good for productivity. But yeah, I think no one ever made me feel like I was the odd one out. There were some physical examples of it being clear that I was the odd one out. There was no female toilet in the building,
wow,
which still to this day blows my mind that you would build a facility without one female toilet in it. So Sir Frank and I would share the disabled toilet, which is wild.
And what was he like, Sir Frank Williams? Because I'm not hugely into F1 racing. Can you just paint a picture of him and your relationship with him?
The first week that I was working at Williams, you know, I understood very quickly that you pulled long hours. And so I think it was the Wednesday or Thursday, and I was still sat at my desk at about 9 o'clock at night, and the office was just starting to thin out. And Sir Frank had a habit of sleeping at the factory 3 to 4 nights a week. And often on the nights that he slept at the facility, he would come in to the different offices and just do a little tour and say hello to people working. And we all thought that that was him patrolling the offices to see who was pulling the long hours. Anyway, this particular day, he rolled his wheelchair into the office and passed my desk. And then I saw him stop and roll his wheelchair back and look over my partition and exclaim to me, "Oh my God, it's a girl." And it was like, it equal parts thrilling and shocking, shocking not in a bad way, shocking in a shocking way. This had been a man that I had idolised my entire life of following Formula One. He's a legend in the industry, and he's one of the reasons that I'd wanted to work for the Williams F1 team. And here was the founder of the team opposite me making a comment about me, and he was so friendly and down to earth, and we chatted for a little while about how much he loved Australia and Melbourne and when he used to travel to Australia for the races. And then ever since that first encounter, whenever he came into the office, he would come up and say, "Hello, Kate, how are you? How's everything going?" And it always impressed me that he made the effort to remember my name. And, it's a hard thing to do when you've got a company of 500 employees to remember people's names. It's funny, though, this idea of him patrolling the offices to sort of see who was doing the hard work. When I was writing the memoir, I was editing it down at a peninsula town in Victoria, and I stopped editing one day to go down into the village and get a coffee. And this guy walked past me and he's like, "Kate Reid, I'll be damned." And it was my housemate from when I worked at Williams, who was one of the team mechanics, and I was editing that part of the book at the time.
Wow.
And it turns out he lives down there now, which the coincidence was...
Yes, from London to regional Victoria.
To bump into me when I was editing the part of the book about him. And he sat down and we had a coffee for about 3 hours. And he said, when I was talking about this idea about Sir Frank, he said it was actually the opposite. Sir Frank hated the idea of people working longer hours, and he would patrol the offices to see what teams were staying back, and then it's likely that the managers of those teams would get a rap on the knuckles because they were making their teams work too hard. But my guess is that middle management was absorbing that because there was still the pressure on the team as a whole to improve the performance of the car, and it was these managers' jobs to make that happen. And if their teams were pulling longer hours to try and make that happen, they're not going to stop us from working late. So I think my impression of that time changed a little bit after talking to my housemate and learning that maybe after all Sir Frank did want a little bit more of work-life balance, and it upset him to see people, really dedicating long hours to it.
So what got you into the idea of F1 in the first place? Did you go to the Grand Prix as a kid?
I did, but long before I actually went to a Grand Prix in person, I'd been watching it with my dad. When I was little, I was really sick with asthma. I mean, like toddler level. And when I'd have an attack in the middle of the night, Dad would be the one to wake up and come upstairs and put the nebulizer on me, and then he'd often fall asleep on the floor beside me, probably concerned that I'd have another attack. And Mum was the one that would care for me during the day. So they sort of worked split shift on my healthcare, I guess. Anyway, Dad has loved cars his whole life, and I cottoned on pretty quickly that if I also had a passion for cars, it would mean getting to spend more time with my dad. And, on the weekends, I'd go to the Tip with him or Bunnings, or to go look at another secondhand car. And then, as well as classic cars, Dad loved with an all-consuming passion Formula One. And so as soon as I was old enough, I would start watching the races with Dad. And this was well before the Grand Prix was being hosted in Melbourne. But then in 1996, when it moved from Adelaide to Melbourne, Dad bought me a ticket to the Friday of the event, which is when F1 cars do their free practice sessions. And for the first time, I got to witness it in person. And I guess before that moment, it had been something that I loved. But from that moment on, witnessing the technological feat that was happening in front of me, it lit something in me that like a flame that just couldn't be put out. And then from that moment on, everything about my life had to be directed towards me getting a career in Formula One.
So you headed off to university eventually to study a Bachelor of Engineering in Aerospace, which sounds really hard. What was the course like, and was it as intense as it sounds?
It was so intense. Like I can't, maybe a way to describe it is like a lot of university courses are maybe 16 or 18 contact hours a week. This was 40 contact hours a week.
So that's like a full-time job.
Yeah, it was a full-time job. And then I'd get home from uni and I would probably study at my desk until 2 or 3 most mornings. So again, it was all-consuming, but I loved every second of university. I think I was suddenly studying this very focused area of engineering that I knew would help get me closer towards achieving my dream. And I was loving the things that I was learning. I felt very intellectually stimulated. So while it was intense, I felt very fulfilled by it.
So it's a big deal then to go from that degree. You know, you were probably one of the few women, I'm guessing, in that course.
Out of 120 in my year level, I think there was 8 women and several of them dropped out. The attrition rate was pretty high over the 5 years.
So you head off, in your early 20s, you end up at F1 with Williams.
At my dream team, yeah.
Dream team. How did things start to unravel for you? Because there was a personal cost to this, working such intense hours in a high-pressure environment.
I'd just spoken about university being intense and high pressure, but I loved it. I think if I'd found the intellectual and professional stimulation that I was looking for in Formula One, the long hours wouldn't have affected me in the way that they did. But it was really, a perfect storm and a culmination of a pretty negative working culture, long hours, being away from my main support network, which was my family and my friends back in Australia. Even things like I didn't get to see daylight very often. Like, the winter's long and dreary in the UK, and you'd get to work before the sun came up and you'd leave well after it had gone down. And often you'd just be sitting at your computer for all the hours in between. And it fostered in me what went undiagnosed as depression and anxiety. I think it was probably this realisation of this dream that I'd had for so long, the reality of it not meeting that very high expectation that I'd built up. I want to be very clear when I say at Williams, we had a beautiful facility to work in and my colleagues were lovely people. I just don't think that my personality was really well suited for that very insular solo technical work, in particular on concepts and ideas that I wasn't generating myself. I was literally just modelling somebody else's idea with no explanation as to why I was doing it. And I literally just felt like a cog in a wheel with only half the information. And for me, I love control and I love perfectionism, and those things, when I have all the information, often result in me achieving something really positive, but only given a slice of the information. And then this negative culture around me, my mental health significantly decreased over the course of about 2.5 years.
So you started going to the gym.
Yep.
The disordered eating started.
So that started because I think a lot of people think eating disorders are all about body image, but more often than not, and in particular anorexia, it's more about big areas of your life being out of control. And then the two things that you can control are what you put in your mouth and how much exercise you do. And those two things, especially when combined, have pretty clear, linear, measurable results, which, for someone like an engineer that loves complex things and loves seeing measurable progress, measuring your calories, weighing your food, doing exercise, charting it all on complicated spreadsheets, and then standing on the scales the next day and seeing the number smaller is those things that I did are going in the right direction. And I'm air quoting at the moment, right direction being what I wanted for the time, not fully understanding that what I wanted wasn't necessarily a healthy path to take.
Yeah, and it's seeing that data and going, okay, that's a success measure.
Yeah.
These traits that made you so good at engineering, the perfectionism, the obsession, the determination, they start to fuel this obsession. And your boyfriend at the time calls your parents. And the next thing, your dad's thinking, I've got to bring you home. How bad did it get, and what prompted you to leave the UK and your dream job?
It's probably something that had been stewing away in the back of my mind for a very long time. But when I think I describe it in the memoir, and I think it's the most perfect way to describe it, letting go of that dream felt like letting go of a very rare and precious kite and watching it just fly off into the distance and then not being tethered to anything, or in more real terms, me not working in Formula One anymore was me letting go of my entire identity and what defined me. And I'd never lived before without being defined by something. I wasn't okay just being me, not knowing what was next. And I guess that as I started to lose faith in this idea of a career in Formula One, the eating disorder started to move in and take up that real estate. And it just got to the point where kind of the decision was taken out of my hands. My health was that bad that my mum and dad were actually told when I came back to Australia that if I hadn't sought help, I probably would have not existed within about 6 weeks. And it's a terrifying prospect. Probably would have been awful for them to hear that. But, the rapid deterioration of eating disorders is terrifying, and anorexia is actually has the highest mortality rate of any mental illness, which I think is not commonly known as well.
People don't realise how deadly.
Yeah, they're insidious. Yeah.
So you end up back in Australia, and ironically, given the circumstances, it's kind of food that starts to give you meaning again. How did that happen? Because it seems like an oxymoron, doesn't it?
It's funny. It's the most commonly, the most common response to, how did you go from an eating disorder to becoming obsessed with food? It is the most common response to an eating disorder because you're literally starving your body of the nutrients that it needs, and every part of your body is sending signals to your brain to eat. It's telling you, we need fuel, we need nutrients. And so all you can think about is food. And so you become obsessed with the thing that you are limiting yourself, which is torture. So you find ways to live vicariously around food and ingredients. And for me, baking was the answer because when you're maybe cooking a curry or something, you'll taste it and tweak it. And I didn't want to eat food that I had to taste to adjust the seasoning on. But you don't dip your finger into flour, to check to make sure it tastes okay. You trust the recipe. And it's also very scientific. You have to weigh things out to the correct gram, and then you have to follow the methodology and incorporate ingredients in the right order, to ensure that the right alchemy is happening. Then you pull something out of the oven and it's this beautiful baked good that you've created. So again, there's that measurable result. But then I'd take it into the office the next day and I'd see how happy it made people. So
Which is kind of different from the car experience, right?
It's the opposite.
You weren't seeing that end part because you were stuck in the middle.
The fact that you've articulated that, for me, seeing the end result is so crucial to my own personal fulfillment. And I think there's now examples in my life from this point onwards where, for example, with Lunar, which I know we haven't gotten to yet, but one of the reasons I pivoted the business was it was initially supplying croissants to cafes, and I missed that final moment where someone bit into the pastry and had this lovely, happy, content moment. And for me, really seeing something through from beginning to end gives me an awful lot of satisfaction and happiness.
This is Curveball, and I'm Kellie Riordan. Kate Reid owns Lunar and is the author of the memoir Destination Moon. So you become kind of obsessed with cooking and this alchemy of ingredients and that end product. And in 2008, you auditioned for MasterChef. What's involved in that audition process? Because I think we see the end result of the people on the television cooking up a storm, but there's a lot that goes on behind the scenes.
Yeah, we see the final 20 contestants that, made it through to that stage. But when I applied, I think I was one of about 7,000 people in Victoria that applied. And you have a really rigorous written application as the first stage of the process. And then they decide whether they're going to shortlist you and invite you along to their first round of auditions. And that was so intense. And keeping in mind, I was anorexic at the stage. I was a shade over 40 kilos. And I think they had about 200 people in an audition room, and you had to bring along a dish. And then there were several rounds. I think there was 3 or 4 rounds that day where we had to present our dish and talk about it to a group, and then we had to taste other people's dishes, which was really confronting for me. I didn't love eating in front of other people, and also the idea of just having to eat out of my control was scary, but I tried to hide the fact that it was scary for me at the time. And then, ironically, you go through a psychological test, and if you pass that, you go through to a final round where you present your dish to a panel of judges. So this is audition day round 1, which I made it through. And then the second round of auditions, you have to cook a dish in sort of a makeshift studio kitchen in front of an audience of the other people who, I think there was 50 people at this stage. And so I spent 13 hours waiting in that room to cook my dish. They said when I got there, you'll be called up randomly, so you all just have to stay in the room at all times in case your name's called up. Oh. And it did feel like they were trying to break me.
Yes. This is a test.
It was. So they had this one thing where they also had the full replica of the makeshift kitchen in the judging room with George, Matt and Gary, the original MasterChef judges. And they'd said to everyone at the start of the day, you can either have your full 45 minutes in this room off to the side, or you can have 40 minutes and then your final 5 minutes can be in front of the judges. And at this point of the day when I got up, no one had chosen that option, because why would you interrupt your cook and do the most stressful part of finishing it in front of the judges? So they came up to me and asked me to do it. And I was cooking a fish dish. And I said to them, look, I need 7 minutes to cook my fish. 5, I'm not going to interrupt the cooking of a fish to move everything in. So they went away and came back and said, the producers have given you permission to have the 7 minutes to cook your fish. And I think at this point in time, I acknowledged that I wasn't really being given an option on this. So I agreed, and I was 4 minutes into cooking my fish when Gary told me that my time was up and to stop cooking. And I knew that had been done for a reason, and I wasn't sure why. But
yeah, you're like, do I push back because I know it's not cooked, and then they know that it's not finished?
And also,
or
I was
do I do behave myself, be a good girl?
Well, I was so sick at the time, and also I was exhausted because I'd been in that room for 13 hours. And I think, when you have an eating disorder, your cognitive ability is so impacted as well. Maybe right now I would say, hey, I haven't been given my 7 minutes, but back then I just capitulated. And of course, Gary came and cut into the thickest part of the fillet and said, well, it's raw, I can't put you through. And my heart broke in that moment, because I'd kind of built up this idea that MasterChef was going to be the next thing that would propel me to my new obsession of cooking, and that was going to be the platform and the pathway. And that it set me back quite a bit. I was confused as to why my audition had been sabotaged, which is what I believe that it had been. I know that it had been. I'm not going to share the reason why, but I'll tell you after this. It's juicy.
But Matt Preston, I think, was like, hang on a minute, she's a talent. Was there a little bit of frisson between the judges?
Maybe. Matt said yes to me. I think maybe now, being a little bit older and wiser, I'm sure they were wearing earpieces, and I wonder if for TV they decided one of the judges would say yes. But I do truly believe that Matt thought he saw potential in me. He actually reached out to me straight after the audition and asked me to come back into the room behind the judging room. And he said, look, I'm really sorry you didn't make it through. I'd really love you to come and join me on a couple of food reviews. He was writing for a Melbourne newspaper at the time. And he was a big supporter of mine. I've been very grateful to have met Matt and to have had him on my side over the years. But I do believe that everything happens for a reason, and had I made it through, Lunar might not have been born, and my path would have taken a very different direction. So yeah, I think it was hard to take at the time, and it did set me back for a little while. But I think it's another example of the fact that I'm a very resilient, determined person, and I wasn't going to let that beat me in the end.
So through this, you are also working at a cafe, and you have this couple, Mary and Al, who sound beautiful. They kind of quietly understand your disordered eating without really making a fuss of it. What were you learning from them, and what did they teach you beyond even just the cooking?
Well, I guess, first of all, giving me a job to bake part-time in the cafe. So Mary said you can come in 4 hours every morning, but she would make me leave after the 4 hours. And I think innately she knew that I just didn't have the energy to do a full day. So I think she understood that giving me a safe space to be around food and to feel safe around it without wearing myself out would slowly help in my recovery rather than burning me out and wearing me out and potentially setting me back again. But I think she never pushed me to eat food while I was there. She became a big role model for me, and I think she made me feel really safe about being around food again. Her family come from, historically Constantinople, which is now Istanbul, but they're Greek, and her diet and cuisine style is very impacted by, I guess, the Mediterranean. And she just, we'd be standing prepping in the tiny little kitchen, and she would just give me little nuggets of information about, wild greens and their nutritional benefits, or honey and how it's a natural antibiotic. And she just started to educate me around food in a way that I'd never been around it before. She's still one of my best friends.
And so eventually you go to her and you say, I've just booked a flight to the other side of the world because I'm starting to become a little obsessed with pastry.
With French pastry in particular, yeah.
And then she says, well, I'm coming with you.
Which was actually the best outcome. I think had I gone by myself, it would have been a very different trip. But again, Mary making me feel safe around food, I was far more adventurous when I was on that trip with her and her husband than I might have been by myself, because she wanted to try things and she made me feel like it was okay to try things as well. So this was really the beginning of the real recovery, where I was starting to have a healthier relationship with food because I was starting to care about something other than managing food and exercise.
And why pastry? What was the moment where you thought, that is the thing, I've got to perfect the croissant?
So Mary and I went off to Paris because I'd seen a photo of some pain au chocolat in this beautiful coffee table book, and that had prompted me booking the ticket to Paris.
A picture in a book?
Yeah, but it's a really spectacular picture, and I've gone back to it time and time again, and it was really like a pivotal moment for me seeing this picture. So on the last day that we were in Paris, I went over to the boulangerie where the photo had been taken by myself. And I ended up contacting the owner after I'd visited, asking if he'd consider taking me on as an apprentice.
So this is Dupain?
Yes, yeah. So I ended up a few months later back at Dupain, and Christophe, the owner, and I had agreed to essentially a 1-month stage. And in hospitality, a stage is an unpaid internship. So it's for someone very inexperienced, and in return for getting to be around the environment and learn, I guess, by observation and osmosis and doing quite simple tasks, you work for nothing. So, which is, that's how the hospitality industry works, and it is a really great exchange, especially for a young chef with dreams to learn about more complicated, high-end things. So I spent this month in Paris, and there's only so long one can live with no salary in Paris.
Yeah. One of the most expensive cities in the world.
Yes. So Christophe had said to me that he would consider offering a full apprenticeship to me, but I knew that the salary would be very low. And I came back to Melbourne with the view to saving a bit more money and then maybe going back to Paris. And we pretty much solely worked on viennoiserie in the raw pastry kitchen. And so croissant belongs to the viennoiserie family.
Which a lot of people don't realise there's the Vienna connection, which I think is because of Marie Antoinette. Is that right?
Yes, that's right.
Yeah.
So
because she was Viennese.
Yeah, and the origins of the croissant is the Austrian Kipferl. And then she married the French king and brought her pastry chef with her. And then he adapted the Kipferl and created the laminated pastry that's now the croissant. So, yeah, it's crazy. I love food history. It's fascinating. So anyway, yeah, croissant belongs to the viennoiserie family. And I kind of got this uninterrupted month witnessing this incredibly complicated technical pastry be made the traditional way. And part of me was like, okay, this isn't making a cake or a biscuit. This is like the Formula One version of a pastry. It's so complicated and technical. And the classic way is done over 3 days with dozens of processes in those 3 days. And my engineering brain watched the head pastry chef and thought, I wonder why he's doing it like that. Or if he did it like that, the lamination might be more perfect. Or if he changed that, it could be maybe improved. And so my engineering brain was critically analysing the process, wondering why something was done or if it could be better. And I guess for me in the croissant, I found that intersection of baking creativity, precision and science, and also just something like wholesome and delicious that nurtures us in a happy way.
Although there was a pastry chef called Sebastian who did not want you there.
Yeah, well, he was the head pastry chef. He really taught me nothing. There's actually this super cute story. Young Ji, who was the other full-time pastry chef in the raw pastry kitchen, she was Korean and spoke no English, and obviously Australian speaking no Korean. And so our only crossover was a little bit of French. And I think I came back from France speaking French with a Korean accent.
So you ended up back home and you thought to yourself, I just have to establish my own little bakery. And as I understand it, as you mentioned, it was just that commercial style. But how did you take just that little slither a month where you did, as I understand it, you didn't even learn the whole process?
No, I only discovered this. I think we were talking before the podcast about the challenges of starting a business and kind of going in ignorantly, and maybe if you knew all the challenges you were going to face, you might not do it. But one of them was, I think I was just blindly confident that based on my 1 month in France and having watched Sebastian with some of these processes that I'd know how to do it. But there's one thing watching someone for a month and another thing actually doing it and learning those nuances and intricacies of processes and why they're important. And my job in France had been to make the dough, which is step one of day one. And so I did that confidently when I started recipe testing, and I thought, this is great. Like, this dough looks perfect. It feels like it felt in France. I'll let it sit in the fridge overnight and do its thing. Then the next morning, like, okay, here we are, day 2. And I pulled it out of the fridge and I just looked at it and I thought, I actually have no idea what to do next. But by this stage, I was kind of all in. Like, I'd signed the lease on a shop, I'd bought all the commercial bakery equipment, I'd bought the ingredients and done testing with different things, and I'd set up suppliers, and I'm like, you're an engineer. You don't really know what to do from now until baking them, but there's dozens of processes. You're just going to have to figure this out for yourself.
And that's what I love so much about this story is I just have to figure it out myself. I'm going to say yes. I'm going to be boots all in. I don't know all the bits, but I'm just going to figure it out, which is, I think, such great life advice.
But it's also not impossible, right? Like, I know they exist out there. It's not an impossibility. It might take me a year or 3. It took me 3.5 months, but I'm like, it is possible to reach the end result. You've just got to keep going until you do.
Now, that, of course, gets rewarded when a little time later the New York Times critic heads along and he sits on basically an old box or something outside your very first was it even a store, or were you still just a commercial bakery then?
Well, it wasn't really. I mean, all bakeries are commercial bakeries. I'd set myself up as a little commercial kitchen initially that supplied to Melbourne's best espresso bars. When I was dropping them off to cafes, I would leave and then I wouldn't have that final moment, which was really the reward for all the hard work. So I actually had this beautiful experience going to see Renee Redzepi talk at the Wheeler Centre. And that particular talk, I left it inspired, and I called my brother Cam, who, he'd worked in hospitality his whole life. I think he'd started work at a cafe in a local area as a barista and waiting tables, and then he'd quickly worked his way up to shift manager and then venue manager. And then finally, Clover Moore had changed the liquor licensing laws in Sydney. And I think it had been very expensive previously to get a liquor licence, which is why Sydney has so many big pubs and clubs. But then she'd changed it to be much lower, more in line with Melbourne. And Cam had this idea that he'd move up to Sydney, and it was brilliant, really, open one of Sydney's first small bars. And he did. I think his was the second small bar in Sydney to open, called Chingalings. And, he fitted it out on a shoestring budget with his friend. Dad went up there to help with the renovations, and he opened it, and it was a roaring success. He ran it for a couple of years and then sold it and was looking for his next project. Anyway, he ended up, some friends in Melbourne were going to open a cafe around the time I was starting Lunar. And so he moved back down to Melbourne to do this as a short-term project with his friends, this cafe. And so sure enough, they opened it and ran it for a year, all the while I'm supplying croissants to them as well as other espresso bars. And then when they sold it, I think Cam did have this idea that he'd go back up to Sydney and maybe look at another nighttime venue. But in the meantime, he was on this motorbike trip And I'd heard this inspiring story by Renee Redzepi, and that was the real moment that I thought, no, I don't want to supply cafes anymore. I want this to be this end-to-end project that is fully controlled by me, but I can't do it by myself because I have no idea of how to run a customer-facing venue. And the person that I know the best that can do that is my brother. He's brilliant at that. Like, his whole career has been built on this customer-facing side, but also understanding how to set up and run a business. So I called him. He's on his holiday, and I'm like, hey, bro, do you want to come and help me turn Loon into a customer-facing business? And I mean, at this point in time, he'd already owned 2 successful businesses, and I think he really had his sights set on some really cool ideas that hadn't been done before with nighttime venues. And the idea of jumping into business in a micro bakery with his sister making croissants probably wasn't his idea of challenging or a good time. But maybe it was because he thought he'd come down and help me out for a bit and then move on. I don't think he thought at the time that it would become the thing for both of us, that we would really pursue for the majority of our careers. But he came down and we did it. And very early on, he said to me, I think you're going to have to start teaching me some of this stuff because the lines are getting longer and longer and you can't do all of this by yourself. So he became the second pastry chef in the business with me.
And so then the New York Times critic comes, he just says this is the world's best croissant, which is unbelievable because you're in Melbourne, not in France or Austria. And you bring your brother in. I'm wondering how difficult it has been at times and also what the real gift is in running a business with your sibling. I couldn't run one with any of well, I should rephrase that. My siblings would hate working with me, I'm sure, because I have a lot of these perfectionist, obsessive tendencies.
Look, I think Cam might say a little bit the same, but I think if he was sitting in this chair now, he would probably say to you that it's probably those perfectionist tendencies that have resulted in the product being so fanatically perfect is the wrong word because nothing is ever perfect, but really pushing
excellent.
That.
Excellent.
Pushing that quality and having a focus on it, and then also that element of innovation and creativity. But I think Cam and we've talked about it a lot over the years. And I mean, we fight like siblings. And it's funny, I mean, our poor staff sometimes, we will resort to being 3 and 6 years old fighting over a toy, if you know what I mean. And it becomes very brother and sister bratty. But at the end of the day, the relationship is too important to break down. And we're both equal partners in the business, and we both understand that if a decision is made for the business that's good for me, it's good for him, and vice versa. So I think we innately trust each other. We've gotten a lot better over the last few years of communicating, and I think we work really hard to try and resolve issues or disagreements quickly. There's definitely been challenging times, but I think honestly in any business partnership, no matter whether it's a sibling or not, there's going to be difficult times because people are just different.
So once people start queuing around the corner, down the street, down the next block, you can't possibly be the one who's baking everything. And in so many businesses, there comes a time when the founder has to let go of control. You can't scale up if you're the only one baking the croissant. So how hard was it for you, this perfectionist, someone who can't stand mediocrity, to let go a little?
It has, without doubt, it has been the biggest challenge of my entire life because Loon came from something that was, there was a hole inside me that needed filling. And Loon was this pure thing that healed me and gave me a new obsession to focus on in a very positive way. And this beautiful thing that was created from that. And I kind of created my dream job when I first started Loon because I was in control of everything. But you're right, once the lines are long, if you don't figure out how to increase your production to meet that demand, ultimately a business won't succeed because people will get sick of standing in a line for 5-6 hours. Some people they were standing 3 days a week for 6 hours in a line, but you can't sustain that. So Cam was instrumental with me in saying, well, Katie, you're going to have to give that job to somebody else, or we've got to hire someone to do this so you can focus on this area. But I guess, the business, I think we're approaching 300 staff now. So all those jobs that were once mine are now other people's jobs. And it's been really challenging to let go of all these little things that I created. But I think that's maturity and growth, being able to step back and see that you've given other people the opportunity to impact the business in a positive way and bring their own ideas and their own skills and experience into it. It's just then my job to figure out, I always need something to fixate on and to obsess over and to work on. And so it's been my job to figure out how to juggle and that challenge of letting go, but also how to keep myself, I guess, intellectually and professionally stimulated in a way that I need to make me feel happy.
And what do your mum and dad think about this now? Through this whole journey, the ups and downs, your mum and dad sound like they've been absolutely incredible, supportive, whether it's, as a toddler with the asthma Ventolin or, today. What do they think now that Loon is across multiple states, multiple bakeries?
Oh, it's such a hard question to answer because all they ever show me is this just true pride in, I guess, what both their kids have now created and worked on for the last 13 years. It's been a long ride. And Mum, we create these beautiful Loon pins for staff, and Mum wears her Loon pin every day with pride. She's so cute. Dad loves a croissant, so whenever he has an opportunity, I find him at either Fitzroy or Armidale in the corner, normally with a croissant or a quinoman. And I think it's brought them an immense amount of joy and pride to see what their kids have created. I think they probably still worry about me from time to time. My cousin said something just so deep to me the other day, and I'm not a parent, but I guess when he said this to me, I viewed it through the lens of mum and dad. He said, a parent is only ever as healthy as their sickest child. And I think that's probably rung true for mum and dad on and off throughout my entire life. And I guess having to deal with the asthma from a young age and then the anorexia for such a large part of that sort of that early adulthood, I'm sure that there's ongoing concern on their behalf. I do speak about it pretty openly in Destination Moon, that while I am back to a healthy weight, an eating disorder isn't something that you recover from really. It's almost like alcoholism and achieving sobriety. And then it's something that you just manage really for the rest of your life. And mum and dad know that because they lived through the entire recovery process with me and they saw it firsthand. And they're probably the only ones in my life that really know that. The three of us lived through that together. And I think they understand that it's precarious, and they've seen me get stressed out over the last 13 years and start to dip back into that. Mum's regularly saying to me, oh, you're looking a bit thin at the moment. And I hate it when she says it to me, but it comes from a place of love and caring. So
you were once told, of course, that girls can't be engineers, and then you became one, and now you're an entrepreneur and you're an author now, business owner. What message would you like to leave for the next Kate Reid?
Oh, that's such a nice question. When I decided that I wanted to work in Formula One, it never even occurred to me that being a girl might be, controversial or an issue or a challenge for me to work in that arena. It's just having that laser focus and not letting go of that until, just chipping away and doing it step by step. I honestly think anyone can be what they want to be. I am going to preface that, and I feel it's a privileged comment to say because I was born into a middle-class family in Australia. I had the opportunity to have an education, and I had parents that supported me in that. And they are a really big part of the reason why I've been able to achieve what I want, and I don't take that lightly. But I do think resilience, determination, tenacity make up for a lot of other things.
Well, congratulations on everything you've achieved. I don't think many people can claim being an F1 engineer and a pastry chef and now an author. Kate Reid, of course, owns Loon, and she's the author of the memoir Destination Moon.
Thank you so much, Kellie.
This episode was recorded on the lands of the Turrbal and Jagera people, and we recognise First Nations peoples as the original custodians of the land on which we work, play and live. Curveball's produced by the team at Dead Set Studios. You can find more episodes of Curveball at curveballshow.com. And if you're looking to produce a podcast, we specialise in that. We've made shows for media companies like ABC and SBS and ARN Media. And we also make shows for organisations including the University of Sydney, Dementia Australia, the Australian Sports Commission and UNSW. You can find us at deadsetstudios.com.